share the presentations from today, provided that we have speakers' consent. If there are any technical issues that you're facing during the webinar, please raise them in the chat, and our team's technician Sita will do her best to assist you with that. Everyone who is not speaking today, please keep your microphones muted. And finally, if you have any questions that you would like to raise or opinions that you want to air, please do put them down in the chat. One of the outcomes, one of the deliverables of this project is a policy paper on the topic of this webinar, and we will be considering the output of the webinar in itself and any aspects that are raised in the chat also when we draft that report. So please do share your views in the chat. Okay, so Sita, you may start the recording now, if you have that possibility.
Yes, I started it already. Okay. Sorry.
No, okay. All right, great. So let's have a very quick look at today's agenda. We have some welcoming words from Mia Nielsen of the Ministry of Climate and Energy in Denmark. After that, we have Tina Schön from the Danish Energy Agency speaking on experiences from the initial phase of the CCS CDR support scheme in Denmark. Followed by Oras Tynkkynen, who is member of the Finnish Parliament, who has the thought-provoking title, End Date for Releasing Carbon, a Policy Breakthrough, for his presentation. After that, we have two presentations that focus on storage or transportation and storage of CO2 from Carbfix of Iceland and Northern Lights of Norway. Finally, Professor Philip Jonsson from Chalmers in Sweden is speaking on potential opportunities and risks associated with CCS applied to fossil and biogenic CO2. The five presentations are followed by a few questions that are raised in a panel discussion with the speakers. And finally, we have some concluding words from Mia Nielsen, who also introduced. And that's the end of the workshop. So with this, I'd like to give the floor to Mia Nielsen to provide us with some context of this workshop. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Hi and good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar regarding carbon dioxide removal, also known as CDR. As Kenneth said, my name is Mia and I work for the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. And the reason I am making the introduction today is that we have the honor of currently chairing what we call the Nordic Working Group on Climate and Air, which is a working group under the Nordic Council of Ministers, and the working group that is actually funding different projects, including the project that this webinar is a part of. The webinar is a part of the project called Nordic Stocktake and Visions, Pathways Towards Climate Neutrality. And like the global environment currently is taking stock of global climate action, this project is aiming to taking stock of the climate action happening in the Nordic countries. Through this project, we asked some of the sharpest Nordic think tanks and research institutions to take stock of the Nordic countries' greenhouse gas emissions and pathways towards climate neutrality. We also asked them to identify new ways towards Nordic net-zero societies and how to demystify what such a society could look like. And finally, we also asked them to pick a few climate solutions where we in the Nordics would gain on sharing experiences on best practices, the way forward, and maybe even mistakes and lessons learned along the way to help others shorten their implementation phase. All activities within the Nordic Stocktake and Visions projects aim at contributing to the vision that the Nordic Council of Ministers have, which is to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world by 2030. The countries have, among others, declared that the whole region should be carbon neutral by 2050, and CDR could actually be one of the tools to get us to that goal. because according to IPCC scenarios, we have to remove up to a total of 300 gigatons of CO2 before 2050 in order to stay within 1.5 degrees warming. In fact, there is no 1.5 degree IPCC scenario that does not include CDR to some degree. There are numerous ways to get there: biochar, land use change, ocean uptake, or CCS, one of the main focus of today's webinar. We have some room for CCS in the Nordics, actually more than 100 gigatons of storage potential. And you could say, by one account, that corresponds to all CO2 emissions from the Nordic countries ever, and then 5 more times over. And on that note, I'll leave it over to our competent panel to give their insights on how we can unleash this potential. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mia, for providing us with the context. And now we're moving over to our actually amazing lineup of speakers. And first up, we have Denmark. I've been working on a Nordic project quite recently on regulation for CCS in the Nordic region, and it's amazed me the speed at which CCS has become an option in Denmark, and the speed at which you're moving ahead in this space. So it will be very interesting to hear more about the ongoing work. Tia Schön, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Kenneth. Would you share my presentation?
Right.
Because I am on an online version of Teams. I can introduce myself while doing that. I work at the Danish Energy Agency, and I've been leading this project of tendering the first CCS fund in Denmark. If we go to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of context. Basically, since 2020, Denmark has had at least one political agreement on CCS per year, and funding has followed. In 2020, 16 billion Danish kroner were allocated. And since then, more funding was allocated in the Financial Act 22 and the Green Tax Reform. So now we're talking about approximately 38 billion Danish kroner in total. I'll not take you through the content of all these political agreements, just to say that the last one from last month basically collected the remaining funds into one fund that will be tendered in 2 tenders. If we go to the next slide, you can see a little bit about the numbers and the distribution of the funding. So the first fund, the CCUS fund phase 1, which was finalized in May 23, is a contract that runs for 20 years, and it aims at 0.4 million tons per year from 26. At the moment, we are tendering a negative emissions fund, which runs for 8 years, or the contract will run for 8 years, with a target of 0.5 million tons per year from 26. And then the new CCS fund, which is a collection of the Green Tax Reform and the second phase of the CCUS fund, will run for 15 years, and it targets 2.3 million tons per year from 2029. And you can see it's a staggering 26.8 billion Danish kroner, which will be tendered in two different tenders. So that was a little bit about the numbers. If we go to 2 slides further. So this is the project that I have worked on. The CCUS fund from 20, the 16 billion Danish kroner. It was decided to tender that into 2 phases. And this is the first phase that I just finished, together with my colleagues, of course. And it solely pertained to CCS, because it was agreed that the reductions should count in the Danish Climate Accord. So the first tender targeted 0.4 million tons per year from 26, with operation commencing in 25. So the minimum requirement was the 0.4 million tons, and it was just a requirement to commence operations in 25 to increase the success rate. So it was we talked about a single contract that could be awarded to one capture operator or a consortium of smaller operators. And it's important to note that the winner of the tender will take the full responsibility for the full value chain. It was a negotiated process, So we started out with indicative offers, and then we ended up in best and final offers. And it was a 3-step process. And just to say that all of the documents are available on our webpage if you want to see them. If we take the next slide, please. The aid is allocated on the Danish Finance Act as a bound by law scheme, which means that we can only disperse aid once the CO2 has been captured and stored. So we have to see the result before we can pay out the aid. So there's no upfront capex investment support, for instance. So the level of the aid depends on the best and final offer we have received from the winner, and the amount is adjusted annually to avoid overcompensation, which is an state aid regulation thing. We have, as I mentioned, a contract that runs for 20 years, but we have made an opt-out option after 8 years so that the utilization aspect can also be accounted for. There's an annual subsidy cap, so there's a clear limit to how much aid we can pay out. And the evaluation model was based on mainly price, 60% or aid level, and 20% project maturity. And then we had a 10% for early delivery in 2025, and a 10% if the winner could guarantee more than the 0.4 million tons per year from 26. So basically we had 3 actors pre-qualified to participate in the tender: Vestforbrænding, Ørsted Bioenergy and Thermal Power, and Aalborg Portland, the cement factory. So 3 quite different actors, so to say. We got initial bids in October and December, and then the best and final offers in March. Unfortunately, we got our state aid approval in January, so well in time for the best and final offers, which was very important for us. And we awarded the contract to Ørsted on the 15th of May and signed it at the end of May. So that was sort of the process. If we take the next slide, I've tried to summarize for you what have we been through and how was it. So I would say the end result was a success, and that's also how it's perceived here in Denmark. We had competition all the way through the process between 3 very different bidders. Only 2 provided best and final offers, but still there was competition through the process. It was a rather challenging process. It's a first timer in a very tight time frame. And I would say the regulatory framework and the framework conditions were not clear when we started this. So there was a lot of work to be done in the context of the framework behind the scenes of this tender process. What I learned was that market dialogue is absolutely crucial if you are to design a tender for first time for a value chain that doesn't exist, that meets the market. And we had several rounds of market dialogue. And also, of course, we did tender with negotiations. And it's clear to me that without that, we would not have had conditional offers. So that really helped both us and the bidders. Preparing a tender in a new field requires significant resources, both, of course, for the authorities that deal with this, but also for the bidders. They have spent a lot of money preparing their bids. And then I would say state aid approval process is something to really take into consideration, and to basically take it into consideration when you design a tender. In this case, we had a long contract, and the Commission was very keen for us to include provisions that would take care of the risk of overcompensation. So we have ended up with a rather complex annual cycle for payment and reducing payment if necessary. But anyway, it was approved, and we went through the process, and we managed. The way ahead, we have 3 tenders. We are now tendering the negative emissions fund, And then we will have the 2 tenders for the new CCS fund. And then the last slide, please, Kenneth. I thought it would be interesting just to share with you some of the critical points that we have been met with both during the tender, but also after. During the tender, of course, it mainly came from the bidders, and they were very sort of concerned with the time frame. When they have to prepare their bids, of course, they have to have their offers in place from their sub-suppliers. So this was a very tight framework for them to do that in. They also were quite critical of our penalty, mainly because they don't get aid unless they deliver the stored CO2. And then if they don't deliver, there's a penalty on top. But anyway, this is a large contract, so we kept the penalty not as it was. We loosened it a little bit, but we kept it on. Then they also said that the guarantees were too cumbersome. And then we had a lot of issues with our entities that are municipality owned. It's waste to heat producers, in this case, Vestforbrænding. They really struggled, and it's because of the legal basis. And after the tender process, actually, it's been rather positive, the reactions we have had, and we have mainly had sort of three questions. Ørsted is firing with biomass, so the use of biomass has been discussed. Do we prolong the use of biomass? Can CCS lead to more use of biomass? Then there's been also Ørsted has based their business case on sale of voluntary credits. So there's been a lot of discussion about double counting. Is this an issue? Will it still count in the Danish National Register? How do we ensure that? And then the last point has been related to the utilization aspect. Since the fund is called the CCUS fund, but we only targeted CCS in this first round, people have voiced, I mean, do we now risk debalancing the CCU up against the CCS? So that was a few takeaways from here. I haven't gone into detail about the tender process because 10 minutes was not time enough for that. But thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tina. Very interesting. Denmark going ahead and being a forerunner in this space is certainly very important. Many countries will need to follow, and the experiences and the lessons learned from Denmark will become very useful, I think, for a lot of countries that will pursue similar exercises. I think that it's interesting that it was a BECCS project, biomass CCS, that won the tender. And I brought something today. I have a report here from 1997 from Vattenfall. And I think, as far as I know, it's the first full report on BECCS that was ever published. It's a report mainly on fossil CCS, but it has a subchapter on integration of CCS in Swedish pulp mills. So that's about, I think, the 30 years will pass in all likelihood between that report and the first real BECCS plant in the world, which I would call this Danish one. That's a very long time, and we really need to accelerate. That pace will not do if we're ever gonna get close to the 1.5 degree target. And that's a kind of transition to the next presentation by Oras. So I think he has some ideas on how one might speed up and accelerate investment in CCS, right, Oras?
I will try my best, Kenneth.
Yes.
Let me just try to find the presentation. There we go. Kenneth chuckled a bit when I proposed the title for this presentation, and usually speaking, as a Finn at events where I have Nordic colleagues presenting their domestic policies on CCS and CDR, I have to approach the topic with very much humility, because Finland has not been very much at the forefront in these developments. But bear with me, I try to argue why there might be a policy breakthrough in the making in Finland, and it could have also international relevance. To provide some context, I should explain that I will be speaking today as a member of parliament, but before coming back to the parliament a couple of months ago, I used to work as an expert on a couple of CCS CDR related projects, and that has also informed my analysis presented in this presentation today. Secondly, I should say in full transparency that I represent an opposition party, but when I, in a couple of minutes, tell about the plans of the current government, I think you will understand why this, in this context, does not play a whole lot of a role. What I'm going to talk about is based on the current government program of the Finnish government. It is a very lengthy document, but I will only focus on one paragraph there. And it is available both in English and in Swedish if you prefer the Scandinavian version. And the paragraph is here. It's packed with different things. I'll just briefly highlight a couple that are slightly interesting. The first one being that the government will finally introduce a separate target for technological sinks, which is something that the expert community has been advocating for some time in Finland. And then secondly, Finland is likely to follow the example of Sweden, and now we heard Denmark in introducing an auction mechanism or a mechanism to a similar effect to incentivize negative emissions. And the full details will, of course, have to be hashed out in the future, but there is a commitment by the government to do this. But the part that I really wanted to focus on today is a kind of buried in the middle of the paragraph. And it suggests that the government will explore and, importantly, introduce policy instruments to ensure that carbon dioxide emissions to atmosphere from large industrial sources are eliminated by the mid-2030s. So basically, after a certain period of time in the next decade, and the minister has been talking about 2035, which would align with the Finnish national climate neutrality target. After that point, large industrial point sources would not be allowed to release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Why is this important, and why I would argue this could be a policy breakthrough? Well, first of all, if this policy is implemented in the end, it would constitute, at least to my knowledge, the first ever ban on releasing carbon into the atmosphere in any country in the world. Of course, we have had various bans on certain aspects that produce greenhouse gas emissions. We have bans on using coal for energy production, for instance. We have bans for selling new internal combustion engine vehicles coming in place in the coming 10 to 15 years. But this would be the first ever ban, at least to my knowledge, applying to carbon dioxide from these point sources released to the atmosphere at all. It would be an interesting tool to address the so-called residual or sometimes hard to abate emissions that are left in the industries. And by industries in the Finnish context, that I would mean basically pulp and paper industry, technology industries, including steel manufacturing, chemicals industry, and also energy industry, so heat and power production. And many of these industries already have their own plans on how to phase out emissions, but there are these difficult nuggets within those emissions that may be lingering around also by mid-2030s unless they are addressed by policy action. And this could be, this measure considered by the government could be one way to make sure that these remaining emissions are also squeezed out of the system and solutions are found to address them. Quite importantly, especially in the Finnish case, the ban would apply to both fossil and biogenic carbon. And it is very significant in the sense that there are not going to be that many fossil carbon dioxide emissions left by mid-2030s in the industries. if the industries do what they say they are doing, which is phasing out emissions. But there would be very significant amounts of biogenic carbon left, especially in the energy industry, producing heat, in the pulp and paper industry, and to a lesser extent in biofuels production and waste to energy plants. And this measure would address also those emissions. Hopefully, this kind of a rule or a measure would push for innovation and deployment in the field of CCS and CDR. It would provide regulatory certainty for companies that it makes sense to invest in these technologies. And if I just take a moment to address the kind of political context, the current government is considered to be possibly the most right-wing and the most conservative government Finland has had since the Second World War. And for that type of a government to introduce what I consider a very significant climate action, I think that is an interesting case for other countries as well, especially those with right-leaning governments. Of course, there are buts and ifs related to this type of announcements. Probably the most important one being that it is still a policy commitment and not an actual policy, let alone implemented policy. For context, usually if you have a concrete measure signed and written in the government program, it will get implemented. Usually it is a very strong commitment and the government will follow through and make it happen. But it's not 100% certain for sure. So I think it's important to recognize this. We have no further information at this point what the policy would look like in practice. I talked with the minister yesterday and he said that there is an interministerial working group looking at the details. They might expect more information next spring, but we have very little details available at this point. How effective, how important this type of a measure would be depends to a large extent on the policy parameters, such as whether the end date is 2035 or if it's earlier or later, and then importantly also the size limit for large point sources. The idea is not to address very small industrial sources for various reasons, but where you draw the line, that has a big impact on how much emissions this measure would be able to address. And I should say that this measure appeared in the government program basically out of the blue. There was no previous public debate on any measures like this. So it is still quite unclear whether there is broad support for this type of measures in the industries and also importantly within the government and the other parties in the government. So it remains to be seen how much support this measure has and also if there's going to be opposition that might make it difficult to pass this measure in reality. But I would still argue that if this measure is implemented in the end, it would be a first and it would set a precedent for other countries and it could have a fairly big impact on our emissions. And that's where I would like to end in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oras. Amazing. I think that for the past years working on or analyzing the development of CCS and CDR in the Nordic countries, Finland has been in some way the cautious country when you discuss CCS, but there seems to be some change underway. That's really interesting. We had a question here from Philip Jonsson, and if it's possible to give a very short answer, you can answer it now. You may also wish or choose to answer it during the panel. Whether there could be a conflict between this proposal and the EU ETS legislation, say noting that a ban is an infinitely high price. Short answer possible?
Good question. My understanding is that there should not be a conflict, and why I say that is that you have the similar question when introducing bans on coal power. And coal power bans have been able to pass constitutional scrutiny and the scrutiny of the European Commission in various EU countries. even though also there you have an infinitely high price on the emissions coming from coal power production. So that's my understanding at this point.
Thank you, Oras. Right, so putting a ban on CO2 emissions from large point sources doesn't make sense if you don't have anywhere to put the CO2. And now we have two presentations in a row, first from Carbfix of Iceland and then after that from Northern Lights of Norway, that address the development of storage and including also how to receive and transport CO2. So now over to Olafur Teitur Gunnarsson of Carbfix. The floor is yours, Olafur.
Good morning. Thank you so much. So do you see my slide there?
Yeah, we see it. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you for the opportunity to speak for a few minutes this morning. I'm representing Carbfix, an Icelandic company that is involved in CCS, very much so, and has developed a method to turn captured CO2 into stone. And we have been applying this method now in Iceland continuously for more than a decade and have mineralized over 90,000 tons of CO2 in Iceland over the course of this decade, or 11 years actually. We do this by through a proprietary technology that imitates and accelerates natural processes. So the CO2 is actually mineralized underground in less than 2 years with this approach that I will explain shortly. But just to remind us, CCS cannot be our main focus. This slide is from the International Energy Agency showing what the cumulative emissions are that we need to avoid by 2060. And of course, our main focus needs to be on reducing the use of fossil fuels, switching to renewables and increasing efficiency. But still for CCS, according to this estimate, up to 2060, we need to capture and store about 115 gigatons. So it's a part of the puzzle in addition to other efforts. But the Carbfix method is really evolves around taking captured CO2 and dissolving it in water, creating in essence soda stream water or mineralized water. It is in essence the same that you buy from the store as carbonated water, mineral water. When you inject this mineral water into basaltic rock formations that are covering almost the entirety of Iceland, you create a situation where the CO2 in the water starts to react with metals that are contained in the basaltic rock. Once this happens, the CO2 combines with the metals and forms stable carbonate minerals, mainly calcite. You can see on the next slide here, the rock in the middle is a core that we took from the earth in Iceland and shows what a typical basaltic rock formation looks like. It's very porous and permeable like a sponge, so there is a lot of empty space in it. And the empty space serves as channels for the water to flow through the rock. And then eventually, within 2 years, the CO2 in the water that flows through these spaces starts to form, as you can see on the right side, filling up the pores with carbonate minerals. So this does not require any additional elements apart from water and CO2 mixed in it to flow through the basaltic rocks. This approach has many advantages. It is, of course, a permanent storage where the carbonate minerals are not going to leak anywhere. They are trapped in the first instance in the water and then in as a mineral in the rock. Turned into stone, it's not going to go anywhere else. It also limits the need for long-term monitoring. It is quite cost competitive. It is not a particularly expensive process, around $20 per ton approximately, give or take, according to the conditions at each site. And it is very much scalable because the capacity of basaltic rocks to store CO2 as minerals is practically endless. The site where we have been operating in Iceland for 10 years is expected to be able to mineralize several 100 million tons, and that is just for a single site. Our methodology has been independently validated by DNV. We developed this methodology quite recently and are working towards working with other certifiers to make sure that this approach, which is quite novel, is reflected in the major methodologies used to certify carbon reductions. You can see some photos here. In the upper left-hand corner is one of our injection wells protected by this igloo-like structure. In the center, the geothermal power plant at Hellisheiði in Iceland, where we have developed this technology and are operating now. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see a direct air capture plant built and developed by Swiss company Climeworks. They are capturing CO2 from the atmosphere next to the power plant at Hellisheiði, and we are also receiving the CO2 that they have captured from the atmosphere, in addition to the CO2 that's captured from the geothermal power plant. So we have two main sources currently. One is from the direct air capture plant from the atmosphere, and the other is the geothermal power plant. We have a map on our website showing where you can find basaltic rock formations in the world, which is a prerequisite for this technology to work. You may have a look yourself at our website to identify your areas. Approximately 5 or 6% of the landmass on Earth is basaltic rock, so it's found in a number of locations, and the seafloor as well is largely made of basalt. Here is a slide just to highlight that the CarbFix method, the mineralization of CO2, can be applied to store carbon dioxide, whether it is captured from the atmosphere, which we call removals or CDR, or captured from industrial point sources, which we would refer to as emission reductions. So the storage part can be applied to both of these avenues, which are most often thought of as, of course, being separate due to the different implications for the climate. We have 3 avenues or pathways to scale this technology up, and I think I will go into the next slides to focus on each one of them. So the first and best approach in terms of costs and environmental footprint is to capture the CO2 directly at the source, in this case the geothermal power plant, but it could also be heavy industry in Iceland or abroad if you have the opportunity to mineralize the captured CO2 on that location or at that location. Secondly, we have this direct air capture source. You can place those practically anywhere where you have some reasonable resources available. So you could locate a direct air capture plant according to where the mineralization is possible. So we are doing that, as I mentioned before, also at the same location in Iceland currently. But the reality is that we will not be able to store the carbon dioxide next to each and every source of emissions. That's why we need transport of CO2 as well. And this is currently our largest project that CarbFix is involved in. That is to build a mineral storage or transport and storage hub in Iceland. This project is called Coda Terminal, will be located in Iceland and received last year a 115 million euro grant from the European Innovation Fund. The goal here is to mineralize, receive and mineralize 3 million tons of CO2 every year, reaching full operational capacity by 2030 or 2031, but starting a few years earlier with 500,000 tons. So this, we are very much active in making this project happen now. And because we will not find 3 million tons of CO2 in Iceland, we will be receiving CO2 that will be shipped from Northern Europe, from point sources or captured at point sources from hard to abate industries in Northern Europe and shipped to Iceland. Few words on where our innovation focus is at the moment. We are researching the applicability of using seawater instead of fresh water to mineralize, which is starting in a few weeks. Those field tests mentioned the Coda Terminal, which involves also unlocking the value chain of international transport, which is quite new, and we will need more transport networks and regulations allowing for those. And we are looking to attract more direct air capture companies to Iceland, because we have some leeway to be a kind of an innovation park for the development of those technologies. My last slide is the first glacier in Iceland that officially lost its status as a glacier, to remind us that things are not going well at the moment, and we have said goodbye to our first glacier. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you so much, Olafur. Really interesting and amazing that we, in only a few years, we've moved from one storage technology, one main group of technologies to actually two. Would you? I had a look at the map on your webpage, and it seems from that map that one of the big bright yellow blobs that are clearly visible is Iceland. So I envisage that Iceland would be a hotspot for mineral storage in the world. Are there any other hotspots in the world that you can highlight, or potential hotspots?
Yes, we are actually already have received grants from the US federal government to explore the feasibility of applying our technology in the Pacific Northwest. The Columbia River basalt in the northwest US has very large deposits of basaltic rock. So we are actually involved there already. We have also done some investigations and even tests in Germany, in Turkey. We are looking very much at Japan. Hawaii could be a hotspot. Ireland does have a lot of basalt, and there are other areas as well that we are excited to look at. So we have a large number of requests to investigate whether this technology could be applicable in several areas.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting to hear. So thank you. Now we're moving up over to Martin Smith from Northern Lights, who will be telling us about the commercialization of transportation and storage as a service. The floor is yours, Martin.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Good morning, everybody. Is the screen visible? Yes?
It's visible, yes.
I'm actually a geologist by background, and I recently visited Iceland and Carbfix, and it's a beautiful technology with great potential, I think, for Europe to address the climate challenge that we have. And I also would say it was very interesting to hear Tina, the DEA's perspective, as Nordic Lights has gone through that whole process in dialogue with Ørsted, and it has been an amazing process, and DA did a great job to play on the competition and get the best offer, I think. But then turning to Northern Lights, pleasure to share the Norwegian perspective and approach to CCS through our Northern Lights project. I'm business development director, so I'm responsible for the commercialization. I've been involved since the Norwegian government took their FID. And we had a number of discussions also in Finland. Pulp and paper industry in Scandinavia is not currently under ETS. There's quite a high amount of emissions in pulp and paper, with huge potential for carbon removal credits and decarbonization. This is our site. This is actually the CO2 storage tanks. This is a receiving terminal. There are 3 yellow people, if you see my cursor, and 1 red person here on the pavement, giving you an indication of the scale. And then this is a visitor center, actually, and in part also a operational center. So it gives you a little bit of flavor of the status and the scale of the project. We are part of the Longship project that a lot of people have heard about. The Longship project is the public-private collaboration and is the total value chain for CCS, where the Norwegian government has supported cement and waste incineration, the capture side, and Northern Lights doing the transport and the storage part. So it's a full value chain approach, whereas, for instance, Denmark has chosen to give financial support for the capture side, and the capture side needs to manage the whole value chain. Northern Lights is a joint venture of Equinor, Shell, and Total Energies. We are building ships. You just saw the picture of the receiving terminal, and then we have a 100 kilometers offshore pipeline where we store the CO2 about almost 3 kilometers below the seabed. This is the Longship value chain. So we are at Bergen on the west coast of Norway, and we are picking up the CO2 from Heidelberg Materials at Breivik and Celsio, the waste incinerator of Oslo. Celsio has had challenges on the cost side, cost escalation, which is largely due to their location close to the city and their access to the harbor. So the space has been a challenging element and result in cost increases. So they're currently in a period where they're taking a year to try to find alternative solutions to reduce costs. Economies of scale, negative emissions are all elements that maybe can help out on the business case. So the project is still ongoing. There's still a lot of public government support to it, and we hope to hear more summer of next year. All these parties have negotiated a contract with the government, so there's not been any direct agreements between Celsio, Heidelberg Materials, or Northern Lights. All 3 parties have a contract with the Norwegian government, and Northern Lights needs to provide service to Celsio and Heidelberg Materials. That's how it's set up and structured. I think there is already room for future expansion at the top here for an additional jetty. This is just a picture of the status of the ships that we are building. 7,500 cubic meter ship being constructed in China. And this is from a few weeks ago. Short reminder what Northern Lights' ambition has been when we were kind of approved by the Norwegian government as a project. Norway, and we are first and foremost a decarbonization solution. So to keep industry in Europe and to decarbonize the existing industry. We are not an energy provider. We are a decarbonization solution, and we are only operating in that sphere of a climate solution. The ship-based solution should give access to all ports across Europe and across the North Sea. Finland is far away, but still we have had discussions also within Finland. It's open source infrastructure, fair and equal treatment to all customers. Cement and waste incineration are industries that will have emissions also in a fossil fuel-free Europe. So towards 2050, that is a market that we still recognize will need CCS. And I do agree with the slide of conflict. CCS is not where you start decarbonization. It's still the solution of last resort. So that's why we call it hard to abate emissions. We are on a mission to demonstrate at industry scale this is safe and reliable. Norway has done it 25 years. They have a lot of experience, but for industry scale and as a commercial service, that's new. For Norway, this is a future business and a future business model post fossil fuel production. My mission has been to develop a legal commercial framework that can make this a commercial business. I said we are not in the energy sphere, but we do provide a solution that can accelerate the energy transition. We can facilitate bio-CCS, biofuels, as well as blue hydrogen. And of course, we can support and help further mature and develop direct air capture technologies or other solutions. So this is our ambition. I think it's still all valid. We are not driven by realizing negative emissions or carbon removal as such, but we can facilitate it and support it. On the top right here, you have this Longship project. Phase 1 is on track to be delivered and be in operations as from Northern Lights. The ships will be there and our terminal will be ready. We are then relying on Heidelberg Materials Celsius to supply the CO2. We anticipate that Longship will actually be operational early 2025. And we are sold out for phase 1. So we're currently maturing the business case for the expansion into phase 2, which is here at the bottom. The dark purple is what has been funded by the Norwegian government. So you can see there's over capacity and spare capacity in the offshore part. Because that's mainly driven by capex of the installation itself. The expansion would be related to an extra jetty, extra vessels, and extra injection wells. That is the business case we're developing. We always said we will develop as soon as the market is ready for it. So it's this or next year that we will need to take that FID decision. The interesting thing about the other element about this public-private partnership is that into phase 1, we had 50% of the capacity used for Heidelberg Materials and Celsius. The other 50% of spare capacity, the owners were allowed to sell by themselves to make a return on their part of the investment. So there was spare capacity into phase 1 already to allow the private investments to make a return on the investment. And then the offshore funding provides further kind of incentive to the private owners to expand. So we have been having the storage available in Norway has unlocked and realized a lot of interest, and a lot of capture projects across Europe have emerged and started to develop. We've seen the Innovation Fund allocate funding to CCS. I think it's a with foresight of storages. It gives a solution to industrials, and then they can embark and develop their capture projects. These are 2 contracts, and they're still of full kind of political dimension that needs to become in place. Bilateral state-to-state agreements. Yara needs permits to start construction. The contracts that we have require Norwegian government approval. Northern Lights is still in an application process for EU merger clearance. So there's still a lot of political dimensions that need to fall into place to become operational. And that is another reason why public-private collaboration is essential to make CCS work. And then maybe 2 more slides onto what is happening and what are the challenges. CCS my experience is, emitting today is still cheaper than CCS. So there is still a cost to CCS. I haven't updated the ETS picture. But this is a negative emission forum anyway. To bridge the gap, there are a number of enablers, right? It's the ETS price and the regulations around it. It's CO2 taxation that a lot of particularly Scandinavian countries add on top of the ETS. There are currently no green premiums for products, for steel, for cement, but it's a developing market. We have the carbon removal credits and then subsidies to bridge the gap and accelerate the CCS market. The emitters and the discussions negotiations we have directly with emitters, there's a lot of uncertainty about the cross-border adjustment and how that will influence not necessarily the European market, but the international competitive position of some of the emitters. There's a lot of projects starting up, and there is a little bit of fear of being first mover. It takes courage. It's long-term contracts, 10, 15 years. So how does a first mover play out over time? Is a little bit of challenge. And as the emitter receives all the funding from the EU or from Denmark, the whole the whole capture project, the whole value chain needs to be managed, and all the contracts need to be back to back. That's a lot of projects, a lot of suppliers, and that takes time to manage and make sure it falls into place at the same moment in time. Northern Lights, we need to have the storage ready and the ships ready at the same moment in time that the customer starts delivering. That in itself is only 3 elements, but it's already taking a lot of project management attention. Then unfortunately, with the war and the energy prices, there is an inflationary environment. We had hoped we would already in phase 2 be able to reduce costs relative to the Longship project, but we struggle with that due to the supply market that is congested, and also the inflation on steel prices and other metals. Like I said, we are not necessarily, we can facilitate negative emissions. We are definitely working on those. We recognize also for the EU to be net zero 2050, the negative markets is critical to have and to grow. On the left side, we are working together with Ørsted, exactly as Tina flagged. There should not be any double accounting, and it should be very clear who accounts for what. How do we measure? So on the left side is a look at the EU policy, the quantification, the additionality of the emissions, sustainability are all in there. Those are maybe some elements that the capture side is more focused on. On the long-term storage, that is Northern Lights, where we have an environmental permit, and we have all kind of elements in place to secure the permanence of the storage. But then, as you can see on the right side, if you want to have a liquid market for negative emissions, there are currently many standards being developed with different qualities. The demand for negative emissions is still evolving. It's a negative emission auctions, as Sweden has, that have an important role to play. Also, Norway is looking into that. Of course, the EU regulatory framework on certification is evolving and being developed, which I think will be useful and helpful to get. I think that's where I wanted to leave it. We have probably used a little bit more time. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to share information or answer any questions. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Martijn. You have some questions in the chat that you might want to look at, amongst others, concerning the price that those who deliver CO2 to you might have to pay. Might not be something you want to disclose, but the question is there. All right, now, so final speaker, Philip Jonsson of Chalmers. We could have, I mean, there is so much going on in this space in the Nordics now. We could have chosen to have a speaker to talk about the reverse auctioning system in Sweden, but we wanted to have another perhaps more academic perspective as well represented. So this is Philip's role today. The floor is yours, Philip.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me and can you see the slides?
We can see you and hear you.
Great. So yes, I'll
Philip, now you're muted.
Now, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you again.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. Okay, so I'll have two parts here. I will give some examples from Sweden assessing the potential for CCS and BECCS, and then now I can have someone else here. And I will also give some thoughts on these two technologies, capture from fossil and the biogenic emission sources with respect to opportunities and risks. So
Nu blev du mutad igen.
It's very strange when I change the slide here. So Sweden has a lot of industrial. It's an industrial country, and we have lots of large point sources of emissions. In particular, rather many biogenic emission sources, as was mentioned here. There are pulp and paper industries. Around 20 of those that have actually more than 500 kiloton of CO2 per year. And we have also quite many combined heat and power plants, as you can see in the map to the left there. And at the moment we have at least, well, you can say, or the three industries that were first to investigate more in detail, including pilot plants. Piloting CCS are Stockholm Exergi, the Värtan plant in Stockholm. It's a biomass-fired combined heat and power plant, quite new, some 6 years old. And then we have Heidelberg Materials at Slite in Gotland, in the right figure there. And then we have Preem Refinery in Lysekil on the Swedish west coast. And all those have plans now, because we have a similar policy measure upcoming with a reversed auctioning system. There are also renewed an enhanced interest from most other parties, several combined heat and power plants, or municipally owned combined heat and power plants in the district heating systems of Sweden.
Muted.
Each time I change slide, for some reason, it's muted. So we have these targets in Sweden because the Swedish climate target set net zero emissions by year 2045, and up to 15% can be taken with so-called supplementary measures, whereas bioenergy CCS is one of those, and therefore there are also proposed targets of 1.8 million tons of CO2 per year by year 2030, and up to 10 million tons per CO2 by 2045, between 3 and 10 million tons. The big span indicating that, of course, it depends on how well other measures are successful. Here are just some examples of a research project where we have made an optimization of transport infrastructure, considered with hubs transporting the CO2 to some hubs at the coast. We have a lot of the biggest emission sources located by the coast, which is, of course, facilitate ship transport to a storage in, say, the North Sea. And you can see here are some combinations. So either only consider the targets of the biogenic CO2, or also combining with the cost of emitting fossil CO2, that is EU ETS. Yeah, there are good possibilities and to ramp this up, but of course also challenges. I'll try now again to change the slide. And here is another example of the potential in Sweden, where we have done for some reference plans, a fairly detailed process analysis of the cost for capture. And this plot also includes transport to the nearest hub on the coastline. In this case, there are 11 hubs along the Swedish coastline. And this is, of course, for nth of a kind plant, and this is for all industrial point sources with more than exceeding 200 kilotons of CO2 per year, plus combined heat and power plants for different sizes. And as you can see, the cost for this capture plus transportation to the coast range from, say, 50 euros per ton up to, quite high for the smallest combined heat and power plants. But as you can see from the box in the bottom there is a potential for around 25 million tons per year at the cost of, say, less than 130 euros per ton CO2, assuming, sorry about the Swedish there in the middle row, but assuming cost for transport and storage of some 35 euros per ton of CO2, which is likely maybe on the lower side. This could be compared with the Swedish total emissions, all sectors of 38 million tons per year. However, the green ones here, you should note, are biogenic emissions, meaning that a large share of the Swedish, as I mentioned in the introduction, are biogenic. And so of course, at the moment, there is no incentive to mitigate those. Also, I should say that in this plot, the steel industry is included, and at the moment, steel CCS is not the prioritized, but rather hydrogen-based steel. So there is a great potential. So these are some examples from Sweden, and now I'll turn into some discussion. I should also mention that, of course, the cost for the first CCS project, as you well know, may be a lot higher, and this is, of course, a challenge to get this technology in place. And of course, there's a lot that needs to be happening to ramp up to these targets. I mentioned about 1.8 million tons per year, which will correspond to, say, 4 or 5 plants of a typical size one can envision. And 3 to 10 million ton by year 2045 would be some 6 to 25 plants, depending, of course, on the amount. And of course, we need a lot of demonstration, knowledge building, implementation, funding, regulations, and so on. And of course, we also rely with storage primarily, I guess, on Norway. So that's important also to observe that the cost is not the same as the price. And of course, in particular, these 2 projects that was mentioned by in the economic presentation, how they will come along. And then, as I said, there are these 3, Stockholm Exergi, Heidelberg, Cement, Slite, and Prim, that are most likely the first one to be considered here. So, some thoughts. If we could start with the opportunities. We see, as was mentioned also, that the EU ETS will phasing out the free allocation in the Fit for 55, and also most likely result in considerably higher prices of CCS for the industry, and also that they really have to pay that, assuming that this will develop as expected. There is a large potential for bio-CCS in Sweden. Sweden could possibly be a CDR forerunner. And we have politically, I would say, a broad consensus on the prospects of BECCS with these proposed targets I've mentioned for the year 2030 and 2045. And we have also, similar to Denmark, this reversed auctioning system that is now by the Commission to be approved, the EU Commission to be approved, and it will be, basically the plan was actually that it should be launched this year, but I guess maybe next year. And there is also, of course, other ways to finance or incentivize bioenergy CCS, which we wrote in a just recent paper and discussed. We're also preparing a report in Sweden on these issues. Some risks, though, finally, my last slide here. That is that I think it's we see in debates both in America and in Sweden that when it comes to CCS on fossil fuels emissions, I think it sounds like an obvious thing, but I think it's maybe not as obvious, and I think it's very important to be driven by climate policy to reach acceptance. Otherwise, it's risk that CCS will be perceived as a fossil fuel industry greenwashing. I mean, if we implement CCS at a high cost at the same time as there is a continued extraction of fossil fuels, I think that's a challenge for the oil and gas industry that often support financially the development of CCS. So the choice should, in the not too distant future, be between leaving fossil fuels in the ground or apply CCS. Also, there could be a risk if the negative emissions by bio-CCS is valued higher than the cost of emitting fossil fuel CO2, then there is a risk for this moral hazard, meaning that we simply do that now, as sort of being accused for just having some negative emissions now to wait with the real emission cuts or the fossil fuels. And this could actually be the case if say, a company invests in this for bio-CCS on a combined heat and power plant, while at the same time there is continued use of incinerators emitting fossil fuels. I think it's also important to point out that BECCS is not given to be one cannot assume it gives the highest climate benefit, considering that biomass is a limited resource and there may be other sectors that really need green carbon atoms, because it will be very difficult to transform away from carbon-based feedstocks of fuels, and if we just sort of blindly support to provide governmental support to put the green carbon atoms in below the surface in the ground for permanent storage, is maybe not be the best. Also think that obviously the value of biomass will likely to increase with time. That means the financial risk for those investing in bio-CCS, because it will also increase the cost, of course, to combust or whatever do with this biomass. And finally, CCS on waste incinerator, I think, is highly questionable, since there are circular systems, other alternatives for that we're actually working with also at Chalmers together with the chemical industry to real circulation of plastics in particular, but also other carbon. So that is something that also I thought noted that was also part of the Danish strategy to also open up for command to CCU, and I think that's very important, because after all, CCS is a linear system. It's actually enhanced the linearity of the transmission system. So yeah, thanks a lot. Sorry about this hassle with the change of slides.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, that must have been tricky to manage, but yeah, I think you did it well. Thank you, all speakers. That was the last presentation. Now we have a slight time management problem. We're about 15 minutes behind, but we'll have to deal with it. I think that many of us might have actually experienced the first wave of CCS, which was in the days of the Kyoto Protocol and the early 2000s. That one died out. Now we're in what I would call the second wave of CCS and including CDR. And this one is driven by climate neutrality, carbon neutrality, and this one must not die out. As Philip rightly said, very much has to be done to get where we need to be, and it has to be done in a fairly short time as well. So the speakers here now, you have prepared for some questions, opportunities and barriers, but maybe primarily, actually, since we're talking about Nordic carbon neutrality, what can be done in terms of coordination between the Nordic countries on a policy level to facilitate faster and more successful progress in this area? You have perhaps 2 minutes each Who would like to start? I'll hand out the word to Oras. You were looking eager.
Yeah. Well, of course, a number of things. I would just highlight, we've already heard today that this is a rapidly developing and emerging field. So if you blink your eyes, you will miss something interesting happening in other Nordic countries. And I today learned a lot from other Nordic countries. So I think what the Nordic Council of Ministers and Nordic countries could facilitate is sharing of these experiences and new initiatives so that we could learn from each other faster. Then I think one of the fundamental challenges, especially for CDR and producing negative emissions, is to get the incentives right. As long as biogenic carbon is not addressed under the EU emissions trading system, and as long as we are missing the kind of other incentives at the national level, the economics simply don't make sense. So we need to have some kind of a relatively permanent incentive system to make sure that it is indeed smart to invest in these carbon capture facilities that provide negative emissions.
Thank you, Oras. Great. And I think that Martijn has volunteered to speak next.
Yes, thanks, Kenneth. They were drilling next door, so they started construction works, of course, this morning. So I maybe I've missed your question, but I actually raised my hand to address the two questions I still had outstanding. Is that okay?
Yeah. This is what we're doing.
And I wanted to say the last slide Philip showed, I think, is very valid. There are elements that we need to properly address, and that we should definitely be sure that we don't lock in fossil fuels. And I recognize also the ethical problem by voluntary markets being higher priced than the ETS market. Actually, I think there is a moral there. I think first and foremost, price is always the critical question. And Northern Lights, ideally, we would publish our prices on our website. The reason why we don't have that is that the transport part, is very, very dependent on distance of the sailing and the size of the ship. So there's not one price in any area. It really depends on distance and to what extent are you able to load full cargoes or not. Okay, so that's the reason why we don't have that. The Norwegian government has a very active role in the whole value chain, and they have Gassnova appointed to follow up the CCS development in Norway. They publish a lot of information. You can find the full document, lessons learned on the website. The Longship project has published a cost basis for the Norwegian government of about 125 euro per ton for the full value chain. So that's the capture, transport, and storage. And I must say the Norwegian government has done a very good job in reducing the costs across the value chain by taking away some of the risks that both emitters, transport, and Northern Lights saw. I would argue today, to make CCS fly, we are not at those price levels. It's between 130 to up to 200 where you operate within CCS. So CCS is more costly than current ETS prices. And like I said, from the Gassnova reports, I think we supply the Norwegian customers around 65 euros. But for instance, the ships that we recently bought a new ship, a third ship, same ship, same yard as the first two ships, and there is a 40% increase of cost, which is due to the war, due to a high demand of LNG ships, and not a lot of capacity at yards. So we see that inflation, and therefore we are not at those price levels that we had with the Longship project. So that's on the price. There was another question. I think we as Northern Lights, we are a decarbonization solution. So we do everything we can to reduce our own emissions. The ships that we currently have are fueled by LNG. We've looked into ammonia, but that was too expensive. We have a rotor sail to reduce fuel usage, and then we have air lubrication to reduce the resistance in the water. So we do everything we can to reduce our own emissions across the value chain, and then we're looking also to the compensation of our own emissions. On our side, the biggest OPEX driver is the fuel use or the power use for pumping, basically. And the Norwegian grid is green, of course. It's green as long as it's Norwegian produced power, it's green power. So I think, but that's where we are, basically, on those questions. Yeah, that was it. Thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you so much. I noticed a question in the chat as well on energy balances and where the largest energy consumption is in the value chain. I can share a report that we at IVL did a year or two ago on this, where we're looking at value chains going from Sweden to Norway. Philip, you asked for the floor, so please.
Yeah, maybe this is so one of these sort of hard questions, and maybe it's for Martin, but I think that related to what I presented, what is the plan, if any, of Norway, that of course goes to also other oil and gas producing companies, to sort of phase out extraction of oil and gas and or turn into producing blue hydrogen or ammonia or some other energy carrier without the carbon, because that I think that would really be an increasing pressing issue, I think, in particular for getting credibility of CCS as a true mitigation measure. I know it's a tough question, but I think it has to be asked. And it's not. I realize you don't represent Norway, so to say, but just it would be interesting to have your reflection on that.
I'm not. I think it's a fair question, Philip, and it has been raised to the ministers, prime minister also of Norway, and when they were on stage. So it's a fair question, and it's related to the credibility. Northern Lights provides a decarbonization solution, so I think Norway, as a nation and as a society, I think they see a moral obligation to provide a climate solution. They also recognize that there is future business related to this CCS in a fossil fuel future. But other than that, I don't think I'm the right person to comment or say anything about it. I mean, we were set up as an independent joint venture exactly to be not part of that energy transition. We can facilitate and help with energy transition, but we are not a player in the energy transition sphere. So I think the fuel mix for Europe and to keep the lights on in Europe, that's an energy dialogue that needs to happen and needs to evolve. So. And every country, like we saw in COVID, has different views and different, dependencies, security of supply and affordability, all that. So I'm not in that an operator in that sphere. So you should ask the Norwegian government that question.
Right, thank you. So I think we have time for one more speaker to give some reflections. So Olafur, you raised your hand, please.
Yeah, thank you. Because I had a hard deadline on the hour, because we are receiving actually Nordic journalists who write on environmental affairs coming to visit us, so I need to leave on the hour. I think this meeting highlights that we have, the Nordic countries, a lot of ambition and some of the solutions. And I think it would be great if we could collaborate further on advancing those solutions. There is, like others have mentioned, so much changing in the regulatory sphere. One of the elements I think we need to look at is the infrastructure for transport, the regulatory framework for transport of CO2. We are going to have cross-border transport of captured CO2 to some of the storage sites. And the European Union seems to be looking at now an industrial carbon management policy, which I believe focuses on transport, among other things. And also I think it would be worth it to have a deeper discussion on what do these double counting, double claiming, or what some people want to call co-claiming between countries and companies. How do we address those? Is also important to secure the integrity of the markets and monetizing the benefits of what we are doing. I noticed there was a question in the comment section to us at Carbfix about direct air capture and the costs involved with it. We are not a direct air capture company, but we do collaborate with direct air capture companies. So it would be for them to address the costs. But I will just say that it is in very early days for direct air capture. And the industry is hoping that down the line, the cost will come down, like we have seen with other, for example, wind power and so forth. Over a period of time, the costs can become incredibly low. The power requirements for the direct air capture plant that we are working with are mainly for thermal energy, which is actually abundant in the area where they are operating. But I think we can do more to highlight that the solutions are available, or the approaches, of course, not solving the entire problem, but as I mentioned before, in addition to our main efforts to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and that we can do more to ensure that the regulatory framework is there and the public acceptance as well, because otherwise we are not going to have successful projects.
Thank you, Olafur. So now for some final reflections from Mia Nielsen of the Danish Ministry before we close.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Yeah, and thank you to all of the experts today who shared their knowledge with us. And from what I heard, I think it is clear that the Nordic countries share a lot of the same challenges and opportunities when it comes to CDR. I think from my point of view, I heard especially that all see CDR as a great opportunity and even a necessity to reach climate neutrality and negative emissions, but that it is still very early days and there is still a lot of uncertainties. And as Oras and Olafur also said here at the end, I think this is where there is a huge value in terms of sharing experiences between the Nordic countries and to learn from each other to accelerate the implementation and usage of CDR. I also think most expressed agreement on the fact that CDR should mainly be seen as a solution in terms of hard to abate sectors, which I also think is a great and important thing to highlight here at the end. But taking in all of what the experts have said today, I hope you leave feeling a bit more curious, maybe even a little bit more optimistic about the future of CDR. I know that I look forward to continuing this conversation outside of this webinar, and according to the conversations I see happening in the chat function right now, I don't think I'm the only one who wants to continue this conversation when we end today. And as the very last thing, I just want to thank all of the project partners for their hard work, and I look forward to seeing the final outcomes from the project. Thank you to all of the experts today, and thank you to all of you who listened in and engaged in the conversation today. Have a great day and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you to all speakers and everyone attending today. I think the message is very clear. We need to interact more and learn from each other. Developments are very, very fast, and yeah, we can do more if we work together. So thank you all and have a great day.
Bye.